From the White House to Capitol Hill, Washington is beset with political problems and debates. From Obamacare to the National Security Agency to the heavy burden of federal regulations. Utah Senator Mike Lee believes that nearly every abuse of federal power today is rooted in one overarching issue: the failure to properly interpret and follow the Constitution. In his new book, Our Lost Constitution, The Willful Subversion of America's Founding Document, Lee says entire sections of the Constitution have been discarded and forgotten. He also shows why it's not too late to resurrect and restore our fundamental liberties.
I wrote a book called Courting Disaster. I cited about 170-some Supreme Court decisions. I've read this book by Senator Mike Lee, Our Lost Constitution. It's a whole lot better than my book. I hate to tell you what it is. And this is one of the best books on the Constitution I ever saw. And I commend it to you. You really ought to get a copy of it, and you ought to read it. Well, Senator Mike Lee is joining us from Washington. And Senator, welcome to this program.
Thank you, Pat.
You were a clerk to a Supreme Court justice, who's a terrific guy, Samuel Alito, and also your father was the Solicitor General of the United States. So you have a long history of constitutional law, right?
Indeed. In fact, it was something we talked about around the dinner table. As I explain in my book, I think I was about 30 before I realized not every family talks about constitutional principles over potatoes. But it's something we did in my home, and that's one of the reasons why it's important to me, why I teach it to my children. And that's why I wrote this book. I want the American people to understand the stories behind the Constitution, to be able to have these same conversations that I had at the dinner table growing up and that I have with my children today.
You spent a lot of time in this book talking about the issue that was going to derail the Constitutional Convention, the squabble between the big states and the little. Would you amplify that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. There was a big dispute in Philadelphia in that hot, sweltering summer of 1787. The big states wanted to make sure that they were represented according to population in our national lawmaking body. The small states wanted to make sure that all the states were represented equally. There was a compromise that was forged eventually about how we would have one house of Congress where the states would be represented equally, the Senate, and other where they'd be represented according to population, the House of Representatives. Even then, Pat, they couldn't agree. Even then, they were deadlocked. It wasn't until Benjamin Franklin, after pleading through prayer for help from the Almighty, Benjamin Franklin introduced the idea that saved the convention. He said, there's an additional twist here that we need. We need to make sure that a tax increase must originate in the House of Representatives. That's what saved it. That's what allowed our Constitution to come forward. And I think it was intervention from Almighty God that made this possible.
Well, they weren't listening to the Constitution when they passed Obamacare and some of the other things that are being done right now, where they ignore that most fundamental point of our Constitution.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I tell the story in my book of how this part of the Constitution, which we call the Origination Clause, was basically ignored when the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was passed. It was a bill that was introduced in the House of Representatives that had absolutely nothing to do with health care. It had to do with benefits for armed services members. It was passed in the House, then it came over to the Senate, and the Democratic leadership in the Senate stripped out all the language from that and replaced it with what became Obamacare. And Obamacare, of course, had all kinds of new tax provisions in it, and therefore should have originated in the House of Representatives. It did not. Now, had we followed the origination clause here, there may never have been a law that we now call Obamacare. We might have been protected from it. This law that has made health care more expensive, less accessible, and has never enjoyed the approval of a majority of the American people. Had we just followed the Constitution within Congress, we might have been protected from this.
Well, there's another thing. It's the Senate almost like a fungus. It's growing every day you turn around. These executive agencies have really taken over the government, and they've taken away the role of Congress. Congress is delegated, and that's unconstitutional as well. Would you discuss that?
Absolutely. So, as I explain in my book, Our Lost Constitution, I've got two stacks of documents in my office in Washington. One stack is 11 feet tall. It contains 80,000 pages. And it consists of the new regulations issued by executive branch agencies last year. Now, these are legally binding documents, just like laws. The other stack of documents next to that one is only a few inches tall. It's just a few hundred pages long. Those are laws passed by Congress last year. And so we see, Pat, that most of our laws these days are made by men and women who, while well-educated, well-intentioned, and hardworking, are not elected by the people. They're not accountable to the people at regular intervals. This is a problem. You know, the very first clause of the first section of the first article of the Constitution says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that before we put binding laws in place that would bind the American people, that those laws would have to be made by men and women of the people's own choosing. We've been ignoring that, and Congress has been delegating that authority in order to make it easier for members of Congress.
Mike, exactly, if they don't have to, they can say, well, that was done by the FEC or that was done by the IRS and so forth. That's not our doing. A good president could literally, by executive decree, nullify all those regulations put in by executive agencies. Is that not, he wouldn't need congressional approval to do that. He could just do it, right?
In many instances, he could. Now, there are some restrictions put in by some laws that might slow it down, but you're basically right in that a president who really wanted to defend the Constitution could at least significantly slow down this progression and turn back the tide toward the Constitution and toward accountability in Congress. My book explains how we can make this happen. My book explains how the voter can become familiar enough with these issues to influence the outcome of elections so that we can restore our lost Constitution.
One last thing. There's a thing that has been in my craw, Everson versus Board of Education, and it sets up what's called a wall of separation. They picked up a phrase from Thomas Jefferson, who was not part of the Constitutional Convention at all. He was in France. You pointed out in your book, talk about the racist KKK member who got on the Supreme Court, and he's the one who wrote that decision, the wall of separation. Amplify that, will you?
Yes, so we had a member of the United States Supreme Court who, having been a Ku Klux Klansman earlier in his life, was strongly anti-Catholic. He was a bigot, and he wanted to do everything he could to weaken what he perceived as a grasp by the Catholic Church on the American people. And when he got himself put on the United States Supreme Court, he seized an opportunity in this Everson case that you referred to, that I discuss in my book. And he wrote into a Supreme Court opinion language that really isn't compelled by the Establishment Clause and isn't really consistent with the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause, as I explain in my book, was intended to make sure that Congress didn't establish a national church. It certainly was not intended to put unelected judges in the role of deciding when and whether and to what extent a prayer could be uttered in a public square, when, whether, or to what extent a state could provide transportation assistance to kids getting to school just because that school happened to have a religious affiliation. And so, as I explain in the book, this is one of many examples of how our Constitution has been distorted, how it's been lost. Fortunately, the good news is, the news that I explain at the end of the book is that the American people will always be in control of the Constitution. They can control its destiny. They can restore it. And my book explains how.
Oh, Mike, it's a great book, and that part about this wall of separation has just led to such an anomaly. It's just crazy what has been done under the rubric of something that never was debated, never part of the Constitution, a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists that had no force of law whatsoever, and one judge, KKK member. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to read this book, and Mike, you're a great servant of America. We appreciate your service. Please keep it up and move higher if you will, okay?
Thank you very much, Pat. It's good to be with you.
All right. Our Lost Constitution, it is a terrific read. It really is. I mean, I wrote one, and this is a lot better than one I wrote. So
That's great.